Good evening, everyone. My name is Mariana Amatullo, and I'm an associate professor here at Parsons in strategic design and management. And I'd like to welcome you to our second lecture. I'm really delighted indeed that you're here with us. Indy, as you may have seen through his bio, is an architect by training. He's the co-founder of Project OO, is that how you say it? Yeah. And a senior innovation associate with the Young Foundation and visiting professor at the University of Sheffield. He's also the founder of Dark Matter laboratories based out of London, and he's really one of those rare design minds that is engaging, truly engaging in something we discuss a lot here at the New School and at Parsons, which is systems level scale of change. And he does this with a multidisciplinary team of colleagues that are taking a real experimental and provocative approach, I would say, in how to write about these problems, address them, diagnose them, but also prototype them and really get into the thick of these. And he's doing it with incredibly inspiring organizations and communities around the world. And so when we were putting this lecture series on globalization together with Andrew, his name came up immediately for me. I've had the privilege of knowing Indy now for a few years. And Indy's name came up because I would say there are two key premises that underpin our curated approach to this topic of globalization, two frames that we chose this year. The first one resides in the well-known observation that we all discuss and that we read about in the media, this question of interdependency, right, that we are experiencing in this fast-changing world where we are contending with a set of phenomena and challenges where the systems change approach, I would argue, is the only approach, right, that we can take if we want to aspire to problem solve, but also to problem seek, and get to some sort of sustainable outcome that we might be proud of. That's the first premise of how we're thinking about globalization. The second premise is closer to one of the disciplines of knowledge that really drive this institution, the New School, and of course that one that we embody as a faculty here at Parsons and as students at Parsons. And that's the discipline of design. We know that design involves people in a deliberate act of making change. There is an intentional before, and there's an intentional after. There is always this goal, like Herbert Simon taught us many years ago, of devising courses of action, right? Turning existing solutions into preferred ones for others. So we know that design practice shapes products, services, lifestyles, and relationships. And in this globalized world, we also know that economies of design are never static. They're in constant flux. They are plural. They are diverse. They're also not autonomous. Design alone is not the answer. They are the result of explicit and tacit agreements and action that make them go on changing and developing. I believe that in this practice renders visible a lot of these negotiations and strategies and the fluidity of layers that we have to contend with in this complexity. So I'm really excited he's here to share and join us this evening, and I hope you will really take it in. Thank you very much.
Well, I'll struggle to live up to that. Don't change the slides, yes. Good evening. I'm deeply honoured to be here. I think firstly I'm really honoured to be in this school. I think the notion of how we talk about social justice in the 21st century at a moment like this is probably more profound than any moment that we've probably seen in the last 20 years. And I think it's a structural conversation that is going to be reimagined in the next 10 years in a way that we've not seen. So, on that sense, I want to start the conversation. In terms of doing this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to briefly talk I'm going to literally in 5 minutes just, give you a bit of background to 00, which is an organization I founded with David Saxby. But more, it's kind of a little, like a mini bio, what we've done and the type of things we've done. But the thesis of the conversation will be, I'll start at 5 minutes. And this is largely to say we've done a lot of stuff, but actually the thesis is, what is it that we've learned, and what are the questions that we're really asking? So 00 was founded in 2004. We're a London-based collaborative studio, and rather kind of unusually for an organization like us, we've spun off a series of organizations, including Open Desk, multiple impact hubs around the world, part of designing the Impact Hub network around the world, which is about 102 organizations, to WikiHouse, which is open source housing, to an architectural company which has won several RIBA design awards, including Dark Matter and Studio Weave. Just to give you a quick feel, we wrote the Compendium for the Civic Economy in 2010, forward by the Prime Minister of the UK. Wrote the strategy for Somerset House, which is the largest incubator in Europe right now, and built the strategy for it, and also part of the team incubating it all the way through to building architecture and building part of building Impact Hub Birmingham, which was crowdfunded, all the way through to other extraordinary people like Mariana as one of the members. This is WikiHouse, open source housing, which you can 3D route and print. And there's like 35 communities around the world iterating it, including in Christchurch, New Zealand. We're able to build earthquake-proof housing and download it to Open Desk, which is an open source furniture company, which when we built, we had something like 4,000 downloads in the first 4 weeks, printed all literally around the world, iterated, and so on. And it's been showcased everywhere. Blah, blah, blah. That's just to say we've done stuff. We've built a couple of social investments funds and various other things. That's not the object of the talk. What I actually want to talk about is, I think, some of the kind of strategic questions that are on the table. Because too often I think portfolio conversations are great, but they're really dull. Dull for me and possibly even dull for actually the audience. What is really the conversation for me is, how do you talk about democracy in the 21st century? And by democracy, I don't really mean the vote. Too often the conversation of democracy is reduced to the notion of the vote. And I want to put forward the thesis that democracy is the power to change society. And that power to change society is much more significant than the vote. It is actually the democratization of capital, agency, freedom, all structural issues, knowledge. Those things are actually foundations of building democratic societies. So if you look at the history of democracy building, actually what you find is banks for the poor, you find schools for the poor, you find all sorts of institutions which actually build the base of democracy. And the question of democracy has been reduced to the vote, where actually what we've seen is a strategic undermining of the democratic capacity of society to act, and the monopolization of that. And I want to talk about what those challenges are, and some of the kind of philosophical challenges to democracy in a kind of much more structural sense. So, if we make the assumption democratizing the power to create society in our cities is the thesis, how do you start, firstly, by reframing the challenge? Now, why I want to do that is that one of my own personal critiques of the work that we were doing, work that Impact Hubs was doing, was that there was a kind of thesis of kind of somehow startups and social innovation was going to change the world. And both were too small, and both were too irrelevant. And I want to argue that actually there is a kind of question whether, when you look at some of these issues that are on the table, so what you see in front of you is a Branko-Milanovic curve of wealth distribution or sort of value distribution as a result of globalization. What you see here is basically the middle classes in developed economies. You see the benefits of globalization haven't really distributed significantly in the middle classes. What you also see is massive concentrations of wealth that are actually ongoing and becoming structural. And then when you put some of that stuff in context, you say 4% of the world's mammals are wild. 4%. Not 40, not 14, 4%. So when we talk about the ecological disaster, there's 56 billion cattle that live in the world with 7 billion humans, right? Just to put the context that we're operating in. That's that. That's land use in the US. That yellow thing is cow pastures. So when we talk about this stuff, are we actually in context of understanding the world that we're really operating in, the geographies that we're really operating in? And then when you put that all into context, this is basically looking at temperature anomalies around the world over the last 30 years. And 2018 was significantly worse. So what we've seen is actually a pretty significant challenge. At the same time, what we're seeing is this, and the US is not too far different from this, which is we're in a world of kind of, everyone talks about Mark Zuckerberg and the billion-dollar organizations. Where is wealth actually being stored? What you find wealth is in an intangibles economy. Where is wealth being stored? It's actually surprisingly being stored in land. And that's because intangibles have a very particular mechanism. They are sunk, they have high spillover value, and they actually create synergistic value, which means the best way to capture their value is largely in land, not through debt or equity or any of the instruments that we typically talk about. So land, bizarrely, in this glorious tech land world, is where value is being captured, and guess who owns the land? What we see is concentration of power and wealth in that story. At the same time, the next part of the story that I think we need to frame this into, and there's a reason why I'm giving this broad landscape, is what we're seeing is a change in the capacity of how we think about production. So this is a pretty useful, I think, diagram that we've looked at around how we went from a craft economy to a first generation, first industrial economy, second, third, and fourth. And what you see is the characteristics of the fourth industrial revolution is the decentralization of production. Now the question is the decentralization of production commensurate with the decentralization of design and capacity? Or is it merely the decentralization of production itself, but in a command and control sense? This is commoditized production. Why is that important? So when we did open source furniture, the question was the craftsman able to iterate and vary the design? And if they are, then you have the contextualization of design, and value at the end of the story becomes not a commodity value, but actually an added value component. So there is an opportunity frame in the kind of new fourth industrial landscape to change the nature of our production economies and where power goes. And in this conversation, you're seeing certain things come into play. Products are turning into privatized markets, which we have no idea how to govern. So if any of you know Uber reasonably well, or any of these platform infrastructures, what you realize is, every government says, give us all your data, yet they have two men and a dog looking after how to deal with that data. There's no data analysis capacity to look at those privatized markets. Markets have become networks. Actually, when we talk about Facebook is not a private company. It's not effectively a free market economy. It's a monopolized piece of utility. It works, it becomes more effective the more monopolistic it becomes. So even our language is not able to describe the reality that we're operating in. And the shift from tangibles to intangibles, as I've already seen. Sure. At the same time, and I think we have to put this into another frame, is I want to bring these two words together. Rising, you've got Brexit, you've got Trump, we've got Brexit, and there's a whole framework of rising nationalism around the world. And I want to put this thought down that maybe this nationalism is a product of actually a structure that we put into play around the precariousness of the economies that we've grown. And the precariousness of those economies that we've grown in terms of creating a mindset of how labor markets are more precarious, your job markets, wealth has been massively centralized. We've created the context for fear. And if you add into that the impacts of automation, which even if you look at simple logistics is going to look at 15% of the economy being radically transformed in terms of actually labor markets, what you're seeing is a massive disruption of labor markets that we probably saw in the early 70s. In that disruption context, actually the rise of nationalism was a pretty recognized phenomenon. So you could make a thesis that in the UK, the reason why Brexit is occurring is because the UK government doesn't know how to deal with the impacts of automation on its economy, and which will disrupt its ability to manage labour market transitions. So, are we seeing the same move everywhere else? Thesis. So, into that narrative, how do we operate? But bizarrely, in all that context, as the world burns, we hunt for unicorns. And I use that term neatly because I think the economic model and the thesis that we're driving is that somehow we're going to hunt for unicorns, but actually they're never going to deal with the scale of challenges that we're facing. And even at social innovation terms, the incarceration budget of something like California is 10 billion. There is no social enterprise or social innovation that's operating at either the scale or the quantum of the challenge. So when we start to look at the nature of the problems and the nature of the challenges and the solutions being offered, there's a discontinuity. And I think that discontinuity requires a different discourse. And I think this somewhere like Parsons and the New School needs to actually challenge that landscape. So, and you can talk about this at every scale. Logistics I've already spoken about. If you look at the disruption of managerial economies, we're about to see a post-managerial cities. So Uber did not destroy the taxi driver, it destroyed the taxi office. So what you're seeing is the destruction of administration and management as a result of automation, right? And what that's building is effectively a sort of a high-tail, long-tail economy and destroying the middle. What we're seeing is the impact of climate change is going to be significant in terms of actually all sorts of things. Nutrition. So the current projections are the impacts of climate change on nutrition are such that in the next 40 to 50 years, you're going to see 10 IQ point drops as a result of nutrition decline. So climate change is driving our food products to be higher in carbohydrates and lower in nutrition quality. That has significant cognitive stumping around the world. You're already seeing the UK national advice on antibiotic resistance is that actually we're going to have to radically improve the water quality of our cities and places to be able to deal with antibiotic resistance that's turning up onto the table. So governance, actually our governance models, if any of you are really interested in anything, the last 30 years is a classic example where we almost certainly look back as the most strategic failure of governance over the 30 years, not 5, not 2 years, 30 years of structural governance failure. We have not been able to govern the transition from effectively a classic corporate economy to anywhere near the kind of network economy that we've been operating in. So what we are seeing is a systematic transformation of the places and the world that we live in. And I think what we need is actually a much more progressive, integrated approach to this conversation. How do we deal with that? So often that's kind of an interesting first step. But how do you deal with change in a complex world? I want to put this up. The kind of typical response right now is this. You've got Michael Gove, a minister in the UK, or a minister in the UK government, who basically turned around and said, we're going to look at climate change, and his proposal was to get rid of, to ban plastic straws. This is a pretty typical response, right? Where you look at the scale of the problem and you say, well, plastic straws are 0.001% of plastic waste, and we're going to ban them. Because you all know cognitively what a plastic straw is. So thereby we are doing something by making a difference at that level. Because actually it's virtually impossible to deal with the scale of the problem. Why? That diagram in front of you, I'm sorry you may not be able to fully see it, that is a diagram of basically all the drivers of obesity. And what you'll see is there are at least 60 different drivers. It is not a simple cause and effect. Sugar tax does not deal with obesity. So what we're often operating in the landscape of our conversation that says, this is the problem, this is the solution. The real world isn't like that. It's much more actually similar to how medicines work. Simple causal pathways aren't actually how they work. Yet the illusion has been operating, certainly in many of our discourses, that there's a simple cause and effect. How do you drive change into that world? In fact, not even how do you drive change, how do you write a strategy in that world? How do you organize into that world? That is a phenomenal transformation. So our models of transformation are, you'll say, right, New York State or New York City, why don't you write an obesity strategy? Really? Is that an effective means of organizing around 40 different organizations, which are probably not even local, they're perhaps international and other forms of structures around it, international trade agreements which lock those things up? How do we organize change in a complex world? I think is one of the kind of paradigm shifts for design. And you can go at any level. This is kind of negative childhood experiences, which we were modeling. You can look at direct drivers, indirect drivers. So for example, air pollution takes off about a year's worth of education of a child. Impacts of air pollution. And they pass straight to the placenta right now. The evidence is we go straight to the placenta. We know also, for example, stressful households, in a high-stress household, a child will, even if you give them all the right nutrients, won't physically absorb it. We know, I can keep going into a list of other issues. So we know the impacts of poverty and cognitive decision-making. What does that world look like? How do you intervene? So to traditional models of educational attainment, the conversation is, let's make our schools better. Well, actually, we know if you want to make an impact on educational attainment, you can look at preschool nutrition, you can look at preschool nutrition, prenatal nutrition, you can look at educational clubs, you can look at the impact of parent-teacher engagement, you can look at a whole system of effects, including air pollution. How do you design change in that world? I think that is one of the most fundamental challenges for the transition from simpler linear models of thinking to actually complex models of organizing. And I think that's a challenge that we as designers are going to have to become much more cognizant about and be able to deal with. And this is a piece of work that, again, I'll share all the slides, that we went into looking at the regulatory domains, looking at some of the drivers, looking at the kind of home drivers, and so indoor air pollution, for example, indoor air pollution is 5 times worse than outdoor air pollution. And you spend 92% of your time indoors. 92%. It is completely unregulated. There is no regulation of outdoor air pollution. So when you look at some of the impacts that we're talking about, and they have significant cognitive impairing, right? This is not blah blah world, this is actually, we know this. And we know, and there's no optimization of that stuff because we're not actually building the environments in the right format to do that. How do you drive change? It's a piece of work that we were doing in Dubai. Every one of those blue dots in Dubai, they asked us to effectively say, how do you reduce the time it takes to get your child, once you move into Dubai, how do you get your child to school in less than 2 weeks? And what you realize that every one of those blue dots is a government agency. Service designers historically looked at every single service, but to be able to optimize every one of those blue dots is actually a complex problem of operating design across multiple agencies. How do we do that? And I think if we're going to operate in a complex world, I think the invitation is that we can no longer design singularly, but actually for a system. And that invites, I can show lots of different examples of some of this stuff, that invites a different type of conversation. And one of the things it invites is you have to look at the problem through multiple lenses. That you can no longer look at the problem through a classic physical product sense. You have to look at the problem through all these other means. How do you design the business model? What does contracting infrastructure look like? So we are doing a piece of work with Hafford, a social housing landlord, and we recognized that one of their strategic problems was effectively in a care economy, one of the big questions, and we're seeing a huge growth in the care economy, our employment laws are designed for labor. They're designed for hours done. How do you design an employment contract for care? Just a straightforward question. How do you design an employment contract for emotional labor? I don't think we've done that work. We've done work around actually designing our employment contracts for hours committed, work committed and tasks. What is an emotional labor economy, which we know is actually the real employment that's increasing? How do we engage that? So what you start to realize is every point in the chain, there are challenges. And in terms of systems design, you have to start to engage in these theses. And you can start to look at solutions through not single solution. This is a piece of work that we're doing in radical childcare in Birmingham. What you realize is there's probably 40 to 50 different interventions that actually simultaneously require implementation. And what you also recognize is the scale of the solution and the scale of the challenge may not be what you're used to. So again, we were asked to look at a waste economy issue, and in Dubai, so I said, hey, come and have a look at our waste economy. I said, okay. And we mapped the problem, and they wanted the typical solution, right? Restaurants and food waste, could you recycle it? And we were like, yeah, we looked at it, that's not your problem. So what do you mean? Well, your real problem is you're going to have to go vegan. I'm not even joking. As in, when you look at food waste, that is a strategic issue. In the next 5 to 10 years, you're going to see that is going to be the big transition into our food economy. We're going to do anything meaningful about actually climate change, right? So when you look at it through a systems lens, actually the nature of the solution becomes foundationally different. It is no longer actually the end product cycle. You start to think about where is the waste. Well, the waste is not just the end cycle, it's actually system scale. And you've already got cities around the world that are looking at that transition. What does the transition look like to a full vegan economy? And that's also a value opportunity, right? We're going to see some of those discourses onto the table. And you can keep going. So when you look at these problems, what you very quickly start to realize, and what we started to realize, was that actually design was a diagonal problem. A diagonal problem that goes from services but all the way down to policy and regulation. And if you want to design in a complex emergent world, what you have to create is the capacity for that diagonal capacity. It is no longer just about being able to innovate products and services at the end, but actually be able to create the regulatory frameworks simultaneously in that story. In the modern day conversation, that would be a regulatory sandbox, which is simultaneously working with actually new product services that are being built in. How do you create that capacity to do that, and the business models around that? And that's only kind of part of the story. How do you wrap the politics around change? So, when you're designing things, what we realize is that you also have to create the politics of those products. And the politics aren't handed down to you, you have to build the politics in a new way. So all the work that we've been doing around open source is about actually how do you create open journalism, how do you get citizens involved in the discourse. That movement building around ideas, radical childcare, we built that as a public conversation in the city with citizens involved. We wrapped the politics around the innovations as they were happening. So by the time they came to political decision making, there was a done deal. The politicians were not structuring politics. You were building the politics around the idea. That's a completely different type of way of organizing, which I think is also part of the opportunity. But I suppose the big conversation I'm saying at step one is, how do we innovate in that world? And it's no longer possible to think about problems just from a product lens. Actually, what we have to talk about is diagonally across that chain. Second is about being human. So the thesis I want to put down to you is that our thesis of being human is perhaps, and the science of being human is far outweighs actually most of our discourses around it. And we live kind of in this perpetual myth of kind of the human as an individual object and the kind of illusion of individualism. And the models of cities that we built around it equally reflect those discourses. Yet, what is individualism when we know that actually, for example, the impacts of epigenetics, the impacts of poverty, pass 2 generations down the line, genetically. What is justice at that moment in time? What is fairness? What is fairness in that time? Be fair. What is a child that is actually in a stressed household that we know in terms of actually impacts on cognitive impairment are significant, or inability to environment? Actually, we know they're going to be significantly underperforming to their capability. What is fairness? When we know poverty actually diminishes IQ capacity. Should they have the same test? Is that meritocracy? Is that fair? What happens when actually you know at a biological level that actually we are not, everyone thinks about the human brain up there, but we also know that our cognitive mind patterns aren't actually just purely ours, they're directly influenced by our social networks. So actually the notion of the social brain outlasts us. We know that more than 50% of us, and I think it's significantly more, is not even human. We are in massive symbiosis with a huge amount of other organisms that make us who we are. So the illusion of the individual is a lovely illusion, but perhaps at the end of its time. And that goes all the way to Dr. David Williams' work in Harvard, who talks about the impact on actually everyday racism and persistent levels of cortisol in the bloodstream. So he's looked at actually longitudinal study, looking at the impacts of everyday racism, which isn't violence, right? Everyday racism, actually persistent levels of cortisone, which means you're more susceptible to heart disease, diabetes, which takes 10 years off people's lives, right? 10 years. So if I turned around to about half this room and said, thanks a lot, I'm going to take 10 years of your life, because I know the causal pathways of doing that, that's what we're talking about. Right? I guarantee you, we go 50 years in the future, we will look back at this period when we knew the science of this, we knew the pathways of this, and we will look back at this in a very dark way. So the science of some of this stuff, right, and the molecular violence that we're talking about, whether it's air pollution or whether it's actually emotional issues, all the way through to, are there. Yet our politics and our policy infrastructure is nowhere near there. Yet we're persistently locked into a notion of meritocracy that I stand on the merit of my great talent, bollocks. I stand on the merit of actually the flows of information and privilege that I said. How do you build that discourse? Especially in a conversation where we built 400 years of looking at the world through in vitro, being able to isolate things, being able to create the illusion of the individual as everything else. We've been able to isolate the world. So here's a thesis. Thesis goes something like this. In a relatively infinite world, being able to cross things in vitro, to isolate them, was a way to understand in an infinite world how they worked. In a relatively finite world, where interdependencies and feedback become material, actually, that in vitro illusion is now no longer functional. It is not a critique of the last 400 years of thinking, it's a recognition that we perhaps moved into a new paradigm where the interdependence and the feedback cycles can no longer be ignored and no longer marginal, because the feedback is vicious and significant. How do we operate? And that has, I think, fundamental. So what happens when we are multitudes? What happens when you know that being alone is equivalent to having 15 cigarettes a day?
And then I come back again.
Loneliness is equivalent to 15 cigarettes a day.
And then do little odds and ends.
What happens when we actually have to recognize we're entangled? And the reason why I ask this is I'm not sure that our societies currently are able to talk about societal scale operations. If you look at vaccination rates, they're declining pretty much across all Western economies. Because actually we're not able to deal with societal goods. Vaccination is not a private good, it's a herd immunity. It's a benefit to society. And in a sense, we have not built a narrative to recognize ourselves in an interdependent landscape. And I think that's one of the foundational challenges of the 21st century. So what happens if we have to start to say that we are they? The notion of individualism actually may be dead, and we have to operate in this kind of interdependent landscape. And what happens when you carry on going and say, into that future, we're also operating in a world beyond labor, where the risk of automation, and I use labor in its strictest sense, we're looking at nearly 300 billion annual wage risk as a result of automation in the next 10 years. This is a massive transformation of economies. What happens if we have to see less humans as a source of overhead? So some of you may be CEOs and leaders, and you will probably have heard this character every time, where a CEO will turn around and say, humans are my most important asset. They're my most important thing. And you say, where are they on your balance sheet? They're my overhead. So humans exist. They exist on the overhead. Because actually, we don't see humans as a source of value, we see us as an overhead into the production of goods. So how do we start to think about this world? So in this story, I've framed you two parts of the problem. What does it mean to be human in an interdependent landscape? How do you deal with complex change, which is again about interdependence? The third part of the problem I want to put down is actually the notion of bureaucracy. So the thesis I want to put down is our modern revolution. I would argue that Uber is not a technological revolution in the classic sense, it's a bureaucratic revolution. It's a revolution of bureaucracy. And that's fundamentally changing everything. And in that thesis, I think there's an opportunity in the discourse. So when we did Open Desk and open source furniture, which can be printed anywhere, the biggest thing we realized, and WikiHouse, was that actually the challenge was how you did warranties. It wasn't actually about the production of decentralized production. It was the decentralization of quality assurance. And if you could decentralize real-time print additive warranties, you could actually build a decentralized creative economy. Whereas if you had centralized quality assurance, the presumption of quality had to exist in the center. So why do I say this? That technology is enabling us to reimagine the institutions that operate behind our production economies. That is one of the strategic opportunities that exist. So if you want to talk about the kind of fourth industrial revolution, it will be about this institutional landscape. And it goes all the way through to property rights. So, I don't know, perhaps not many of you here own property. Put your hands up if you own property, if you will, right? So, here's a nice little game that the rest of you will enjoy. Whose property has gone up in value? Yes, right. So, if I moved your property to the middle of Nova Scotia, would it have gone up in value? Middle of nowhere, no. So the physical property is a depreciating asset. The land itself, hopefully, is marginal cost. So what has gone up in value? What has gone up in value is the monopolistic access that that property gives you to transportation goods, labor markets, public utility, parks. It is the monopolistic access that has gone up in value, not your physical property. Now that's a very interesting conversation, because when you unpick property from that lens, that you realize that what's really gone up in value is common goods. And common goods have gone up massively in value over the last 30 years. It is not property itself. It is property which has artificially been privileged by that value. Now, in that thesis, it does really open the question. The big housing boom that we've seen, was it a disproportionate value extraction by a generation of people that had that monopolistic access? Or was it actually how value was created? So what happens when you are able to create linked value? What happens when you're able to create linked value between infrastructure rights and public goods and effectively that private value? That world is almost already there. So the bureaucratic transformation of being able to create linked value rights is there. What happens in that world? Because I think it changes the nature of property and the privatization of value that we've seen in the city. The city is not a product of a single house. The city is a product of all those public goods additive in an aggregate sense. Our conceptions of that and our ability to manage that is now possible, which means that there's a foundational opportunity to reimagine the privatization of value that we've seen. You can keep going. You guys all know the High Line, right? So the High Line is a brilliant story of everything that we think is kind of the non-obvious. High Line, beautiful thing. Massive amounts of common good, which created huge amounts of private value for about a block either side of it. So we know public investment, public good, creates huge amounts of private value. Now, the interesting thing is we're almost now able to build smart covenants that link back to those property rights back to common goods. So there's a whole new class of relationship possible between common goods and private goods because the administrative class of being able to make micro covenants with 10,000 properties is now near zero. I can structure a new class of business model, which is a systems business model, which means things that we could artificially not structure, we can structure right now. So in that world, we know, for example, an outstanding state school in the UK puts 100,000 on a price of a local house. So common goods create private value. We can make those linkages and rebalance those equations, which have artificially been skewed in the hands of actually private value. So a system business model can look at land value capture. We can do that. We can look at real footfall pricing, so real-time footfall pricing of actually sort of restaurants or anything else. We can also look at future liabilities and outcomes, so looking at the health outcomes that that park generates. We can create a whole new form of public good models that actually have not been possible before, because technology is allowing us to be able to do that. And why I say that is that I think intuitively we've known the value creation processes. We haven't been able to build the business cases or the system business cases and the administrative infrastructure to do that. That is catching up. So I'll give you the parallel example. In Paris, they are looking, or we're part of a team, looking at how you can, instead of building a huge 1.5 billion euro rainwater sewer, they're looking at how you can do 650 micro-sustainable urban drainage schemes. And the challenge for doing it, as you can rightly figure out, is the sewer is an asset that sits on the balance sheet. A tree isn't. So you have to virtualize, you have to create a virtual asset around the tree, you have to create virtual environmental services, you have to wrap it up, but that is now possible. You can even do micropayments to induce people to do that. So the thesis that we could create at a design level is now able to be constructed at an operational and organizational level. That is a revolution. So there is a linking up that's happening that I think is really important. And then, we're working on this, which is the London High Line, which is looking at exactly that. How do you build a common good business model which allows for investment onto the common good, but recaptures the private value that's accrued from it and allows us to be able to invest in common goods in different ways. And then you could do all the other things. Imagine if you could take a house and you can separate use rights, development rights, future development rights. Why do I talk about future development rights? Because I can tax them differentially. So the future development rights, I can tax them as speculative assets as opposed to current use rights, which means I can differentiate between the use value of the city and the speculative value of the city. That is now possible in a way that it never was. And it wasn't only possible for the large products, I can do that at the house scale. That opens up a whole opportunity to think. Now, why am I saying this? Is as designers, is this bureaucratic revolution that actually transforms our city and how we think about it. And as designers, we often miss to looking at these things. And we're working with people in London about allowing householders to be able to split their plots and to be able to split those plots and be able to trade those in a really different way. If we did that, we could release nearly 300,000 housing units in London very effectively. So what happens when you allow, and that's distributing wealth, right? It's not wealth in the hand of landowners or developers, it's the hands of actual households. You've actually created wealth distribution in that thesis. So these sort of infrastructures are now possible. At the same time, you've got digital regulation. I can do this real time. We're working with Southwark on effectively looking at planning regulation using satellite data and a combination of real-time stuff. So we can manage and govern this in a way that we've never been able to do. Keep going. Street licensing. And I'm going to give you examples because these are illustrative of a different way of looking at the city. Most cities are actually the zonal capacity, but there's also a bunch of licensing rules. Licensing, you can reimagine. This is a whole list of licensing that exists in UK cities, city licensing infrastructures. You can actually do real-time street licensing at point of sale. What happens if you have a street card and you want to sell a restaurant? I can do street licensing at the point of sale on the iPhone. I can do smart receipts which actually record that infrastructure. I can pay real-time taxation. I can actually do sensor-driven infrastructure, geo-fenced. I think hopefully the next slide does. No, the next slide doesn't do that. So you can do geofenced street licensing, real-time. You can do all of that stuff. You can do parametric regulation around that. You can do sensor-driven compliance. What does that do to the real-time management of cities? Will we have to do zonal planning at all, or will we do real-time, actually sensor-driven models of control, outcome-based planning models? What will that do to the use of our cities? Right. Now, again, what am I pointing at? Just the licensing laws being digitized is a paradigm shift in how we start to organize a city. At the same time, how do we start to think about actually governance at a more structural level? Often our conversations of governance are about corporate governance, rule-based systems. What does machine-to-machine governance look like? What does machine learning governance look like? How does a pure machine-to-machine economy? So already we're looking at nearly 40% of our economy in the next 10 years become a pure machine-to-machine trading economy, ignoring the financial system. Financial system, 92% of trades are pure machine-to-machine driven. So what does that look like in that story? The relationship of governance in that story. How do you even think about governance at a conceptual level? Is governance about control, or is governance about ennoblement? do we design our technologies to control us, or do we invite them to actually enable us? So we know, for example, the work that happened with judges, that if you told judges what to do, they reacted very badly. But if you just showed judges what their decision was, the spectrum of decisions around the world or around the nation, actually they made much better, which is about enlightening them as to their biases and their decision-making process. What is the role of governance technology in being able to shift biases and control that? We know that's going to be key. And the problem I want to put to the table is our thinking on this stuff is really narrow. So I was speeding and my uncle had passed away, and the police called me and they said, speeding, what are you doing? I said, look, my uncle's passed away. He said, fine, I'll give you a ticket, go to the court and say what's happening, it'll be fine. So I went to the court 3 months later and the judge said, right, I understand, and passed it. That's called loosely coupled, where the event happens, the order is given and the compliance is loosely coupled. Imagine a world in technology where effectively your car doesn't allow you to drive over 30 miles an hour. That's a tightly controlled system. So I would argue that our model of governance is increasingly through a technological sense, actually reducing capacity for humans to make decisions and centralizing those decisions. Whereas what does a different model of governance look like, which invites you to be more noble? Governance need not be a control issue. It can be an invitation to actually look after public good in radically different ways and invite that public good order in different moments. So again, I'm sort of putting an emphasis here on bureaucracy because when you look at it, you can look at all sorts of stuff. Dynamic incentive regulation, geolocation of boundaries, parametric standards. These things are going to come to the table which will change the rules of how we organize cities. Look at the rules. The rules are about to be absolutely transformed. Okay? And they will change everything else that follows it. And if you want to look at AI, the real thing you are going to be governing is not the algorithms which everyone talks about, it's what information data you put into the algorithms. It's the input data that's actually changed. The nurturing data that's actually more significant. So when you look at some of this stuff, how do you look at it? So this is a piece of work that we're doing in Korea, which looks at actually the street lighting story. You go all the way through to kind of oath, digital oaths, pledges, geolocation, auto compliance, digital confirmation, smart receipts, provenance. You can start to structure the stuff in a radically different way. And that changes the city. So again, bringing the thesis back out, a whole notion of actually property rights, whole notions of digitized policy. Imagine policy which is machine readable policy. That work has already started in New Zealand. What does that do to the world? What does it do to legibility? What does it do to the legitimacy of policy information? How do you look at any of that stuff? Oops, we got this screen. So, future of contracting. What will the nature of contracting do to actually the nature of business models? The private business model between two parties was a function of largely the efficiency of contracting between two parties. What happens when I can contract with 1,000 parties in a different format? That's some of the story. Then the future of licensing. I think these structures are going to transform our city in the way that we've not been operating before. And this is something that's also important, this is kind of the healthcare cost for poor housing. So we already know that bad housing actually produces a healthcare cost, yet we're not able to do anything about it because the housing budget is held by one organization and the healthcare costs are held by a different organization. How do we start to bridge that conversation, I think is really important. So already in places like Canada, there's some really interesting conversations now going on about what does a preventative health economy look like? How do you amortize future healthcare costs and bring them back to present day value to allow for preventive intervention? The biggest transformation of our health economy will be not analog to digital or anything else, it will be going from treatment to prevention. And that is now possible because we have the data infrastructure to be able to do that, and we have the data infrastructure to be able to prescribe in that way. That, I think, is, keep an eye out. It's about individual, it's about social network, and it will be about spatial. So what does that do? And that has whole system level conversations. Future of accounting conversation, future of how you prescribe, future of how you drive legitimacy, how do you move the data around. All of that stuff is actually central to that discourse. But also, some of this stuff comes back to this. This is actually building dollar blocks, and what you find is that this was work done in, I think, 2001, 2002, which looked at reincarceration costs. Right? Urban blocks were costing $1 million. Every one of those red blocks was costing $1 million. So if we can look at social costs and look at actually the present day value of them, you can start to actually do capital investment against them. The reason why states don't do this is because states do not carry future liabilities. They do not look at the future incarceration costs. It's a present cash-to-cash economy. That's my $10 billion that California spends every year. They don't look at, in the next 10 years, that $10 billion. If I added it all up, I would be very smart and be able to deal with it in different ways. That's because of actually our accounting rules. So it's not that people are stupid, it's the fact that we don't have the accounting infrastructure. $1 million blocks was a visualization of that. Social impact bonds, I don't know how many of you know that, are effectively a way of looking at future social costs and allowing for capital investment against them. And that sort of stuff is a flow of the future. Now, when you start to look at that, you start to realize there's a piece of work that we're doing around Civic Capital Lab in Canada. You look at how you crystallize future risk and future liabilities is actually one of the most biggest paradigm shifts that's now possible. So 1666, right, was the Great Fire of London. The Great Fire of London gave birth to the insurance industry. And that gave birth to the fire brigade. Because the fire brigade service was born by the insurance industry, recognizing it was a hell of a lot cheaper to pay people to put out the fire than to pay people for the creep. So when you start to structure future risk, you allow for actual preventative investment. It's a brilliant organization that's called Reef Capital, which basically looked at insuring properties by the beach. And they insured the properties and took the premium to restore the reef, which would reduce the flooding risk. So when you start to crystallize risk, and that crystallization could be risk, could be future opportunity, like tax increment financing beyond the kind of infrastructure stuff, when you look at that stuff, you can start to actually radically change what you do and how you do it. And the reason why I say this, our cities are facing the biggest structural risk profile that we've probably seen for the last 30 to 40 years, if not more. So the ability to structure risk and materialize that structural risk is going to be significant in driving the transformation. And that's just one aspect, how we drive the kind of system financing, how we invest in multiple interventions, the democratization of that finance, and the transparent governance of that stuff is going to be absolutely key. And we've been building a whole bunch of case studies around the world around some of that stuff, which will be public early next year in January. And that opens up whole new ways of financing. So this is a piece of work we're doing with Nesta in the UK, which is a national endowment, to look at how could you finance innovation, not through debt and equity, but looking at future land value. So that would mean that you would have an innovation endowment which would say, I want a percentage of land value uplift as a mechanism to do it. That means I can finance culture. That means I can finance open source projects. That means I can finance institutional transformation, because I'm not looking for direct returns. I'm looking at spillover effects on an intangible economy. And the reason why I say this is I think the technology is allowing us not only to be able to administer this stuff, but to measure and govern this stuff. And that allows us to move away from this arbitrary landscape of startups. This kind of idea that the future will be only created by startups. It won't. It will be created by being able to think at a system scale and be able to organize and manage at that scale. That is a real thing that's going to happen over 6 cities. So when you put all this stuff together, and I wanted to give you a landscape of, these are not questions that I'm saying I know the answers to, right? I'm purely indicating the things that are absolutely burning in our minds. What does it mean to be human? Because I think the paradigm of how we imagine ourselves is foundational to the discourse. How do we organize in complexity? How do we design in complexity? The third thing is recognizing the revolution of what bureaucratic innovation is going to do to allow us to do some of that stuff. And in that thesis, I think one of the biggest things we're going to see is a structural look at how we drive change. So one of the things that I've been talking a lot about is if you want to look at a high performance cognitive high performance cognitive and emotional city of the future, you are going to have to change the biological conditions, air pollution, water rights, nutrition. You have to change the biological flows and the ecological flows of that city, all the way through to genomes, the kind of ecological markers of the ground. You're going to have to look at institutional transformation. And remember this, the first industrial revolution that happened in the UK happened for very particular reasons. One, educational reform had already happened before the 1750s. So they'd already created the educational institutional infrastructure. Two, the distribution of wealth was greater than Holland, which was equally well primed to be the center of that industrial revolution. The distribution of wealth is absolutely fundamental to actually create the distributed capacity to innovate. So you had the educational capacity and you had the wealth capacity, and then they had new institutions. Encyclopedia Britannica was actually an open source piece of infrastructure moving knowledge through that economy. So what are the institutional infrastructures of tomorrow? And then you can get into all the technological and governance stories. So if we're looking at transition design, you're looking at transition design across those fields. It is not a technological story. It is biological, institutional, and actually technological and governance oriented. But here for me are some questions, right? What is freedom? Like, all those conversations open up some really, I think, meaty questions. What is freedom in an interdependent world? Freedom to escape, Elon Musk style? Freedom to what? Freedom to be slightly slack in the system? Freedom to care? What is democracy in a post-privacy landscape? Right? So I think the best way I've seen it described is that we live in the illusion of privacy. Privacy no longer functions. We're already living in a post-privacy world. In which case, does democracy function? How does it function? What is agency in a predictive economy? What is work beyond humans as labor and the configuration of humans as labor or agents of discovery? What if humans are agents of discovery? How do we do that? What is collective governance in an age of complexity? How do we break the architectures of legitimacy? And I think the biggest challenge for us is how do you build the capacity for societal innovation? So if you look at AI or any of this infrastructure, and I think most of the technologies that we're opening up, the biggest threat, I think, to Western futures is that we do not have a mechanism to innovate at a societal level. Our mechanisms of innovation are actually locked to the individual. And I think that's the biggest challenge, and I think the biggest threat to our ability to operate. So AI is not an individual problem. It's a societal scale question. And I don't think we have the legitimacy to do that. Look at trust, which is pretty much declining at every institutional level. Education, professions, government. Without it, I think we have a paradigm problem. And I think that's going to be one of the biggest questions for us. How do we build the capacity for societal innovation? And I think that is not about social level issues, it's about the scale of building a different conversation. Now, let me bring it back. So the thesis I want to put forward to you, that if we want to talk about genuine democracy, we have to reimagine those hard questions. And I think those hard questions, I don't have the answer for, but I do know they are the questions of our age. And I think that's where someone like Parsons and someone like Parsons and Houston need to be reimagined this discourse at a fundamental level. And I think if we're going to challenge and rebuild democracy, I think this is not about politicians. It's about all of us trying to deeply restructure that conversation in a hard way. So, at the end of that, this is my favorite film, Interstellar. Who's watched Interstellar, right? So, I think this is the biggest risk, right? That if we make this future a zero-sum game, and we make the future effectively, it's only going to be a little bit more, a little bit less than now. The only argument is how much will you have and how much will I have? And the fight is between that. Whereas if the future is infinite, which I think it is, because it doesn't have to be materially infinite, it can be actually immaterially infinite, then the question opens up a whole different discourse. So in order to drive this conversation, we have to reimagine the future as genuinely being infinite. and reimagine the possibility of our place in the stars. And I think it's really important. I think Interstellar is a beautiful film because it tells the actual discourse of how a conservative, sustainable approach actually drives us to ruin because we lose the capacity to imagine radical futures. And that, I think, for me, is the ultimate goal of Sutherland Parsons in school, is to actually challenge and break the colonization of our future by a narrow mindset of actually what the future can hold. And so I'm delighted and honored to be here and to be part of this conversation. And I thank you. Happy to take questions or have a conversation. More importantly, I think there's certainly smart people in the room. I'm sure we can have a nice conversation. I'm happy to do the mic round, so have a very good thoughts, reflections. Yeah, it's on. Yeah, it's on.
Can you just explain the title of your talk? It was I think the boring revolution of our cities. I'm not understanding what was boring about that, or could you just clarify that?
Yeah, so the reason why I say it is that too often as designers, I mean, certainly for me, one of the things that happened was it was so exciting to talk about the wiki house and stuff like that, the kind of product story. But actually, what we realized was the real innovation was additive warranties. Because if you can do additive warranties, I can decentralize design, I can change land registries. That is where the revolution really is, and really changing the design focus from being around products to these institutional infrastructures. And whether those institutional infrastructures are designed by tech geeks or whether they're designed by actually the optimization of current ideas of bureaucracy or designed for social good, I think is open to question. So the boring revolution for me is the reinvention of bureaucracy in the 21st century and how we reinvent it as enabled by technology. It's not going from analog to digital. I think when it makes that transition, it becomes something radically different. So the reason why we've ended up with the cities we have is because actually the efficiency of land registry, the way it's currently structured, the property rights are bundled together because actually the complexity of unbundling them would be too difficult to handle in bureaucratic terms. So these are functions of the nature of bureaucracy, and I think that's what's transforming. And that's kind of the third part of the conversation. So in a way, that's why we talk about the boring revolution. And the most difficult part of this for me is actually the reconfiguration of what it means to be human, because I think that's a real mind shift in the kind of world of interdependency. How do we operate? Because we're so psychologically preconditioned to actually think about ourselves as individuals, and the idea of kind of meritocracy was written as a thesis in the 1950s by people like Michael Young. And when he wrote about it, it was meant to be a parody, and people took it seriously. It was meant to not be, there's nothing meritocratic. And we sit where we are as a small component of a function of our skill. The rest is all privilege in hidden formats. So that's why the word revolution.
Another question. You emphasize the interdependent nature of human nature in a way that threatens received understandings of individuality, associated with sort of the modern liberal tradition. But isn't democratic politics itself an expression of a quite thoroughgoing individualistic understanding of human nature? And yet you said or seem to celebrate democratic politics repeatedly in this talk. So are those ideas in some kind of tension?
Yeah, I think when I talk about democracy, it's I frame it from the kind of the capacity to create shared futures together. The tools and the means of creating democracy, I'm not really sort of espousing it that kind of straightforward sense. What I am saying is, how do we recognize the democracy in an interdependent landscape? How do we recognize fairness and justice in any of those theses? I think it's open for debate. I think our thesis of, look, I'm very convinced in 100 years' time we will look back into this period and talk about actually almost a kind of form of genocide going on to be quantum of our population. We will almost talk about it, because the science is not in any ways challengeable. It's there. So, if I put you all into Star Trek world and took you up to Captain Kirk world, you will almost certainly recognize that reality. So the question is, we haven't built the politics around that and the ability to build that conversation. And if we look at gender wage inequality, so I think the current projections are in the UK in 150 years we'll have gender wage equality. 150 years? 150 years? Right? This is bollocks. So we have a kind of notion of a social contract that says that we are equal, but the reality is far from it. And I think it's that gap that is now not only visible, it's also articulate. And I think that's where we're getting the challenges that we're getting. That the social contract is fundamentally corrupted. It's not real. We talk about equality, but we're not there. And I think that gap is visible to paramount. So people often say to me, but things are much better than they were. But that's not what people are measuring it against. People are measuring against, well, what did you say it was? What is it? And the gap is between that, rather than historically looking back at gender wage equality in that sense. So I think it's a real issue.
So you talked at the end of the talk about this idea that futures are infinite, and I think that's an interesting way of envisioning what futures actually are. But it's also possible to think about futures as really just these stories that we tell ourselves, tell one another about what other presents might look like. And at this point in various societies around the world, there may be confines within those societies that might act to limit the imaginations that allow for those futures to expand. I'm thinking about the types of censorship that are happening in places like China. So in contexts like that, how do we think about the necessity for imagination to push past some of these challenges that you're talking about?
Yeah, so I'll play a little bit here. I think we can often talk about China through a disparaging sense of kind of the control. But when you have 8 to 9% growth, you get effectively a notion of slack in the system that we have not seen anywhere in the Western economies. So in that notion of control, there's also a new freedom through economics that's emerging. That certainly in the US, since the 1970s, Elizabeth Warren's work on this is brilliant. So when a single person household had 9% savings, in 2004, a double income household has minus 2% savings. So I think there's a much more structural question here, and I think thank you for bringing this up, which is, I think what we've created is effectively the precariousness of being through labour markets, through our economic thesis, which actually in return builds a short-termness of actually our capacity to think. And when you can do societal kind of effective societal scale neuroscience nudging, if you build that precariousness of being and our economic realities, you also create the vulnerability to fear, you reduce this time cycle of thinking, you create the reactionary politics that we've built. So how much of our politics is actually a function of what the systems of the economics that we've designed? And I think that then throws up a really philosophically interesting question, that if you want to change the politics, is it just about the politics, or is it actually about the institutional infrastructures and the bias that we've generated at a structural level over the last 30, 40 years? And I think that is a really interesting question. So are we not able to think about the future because of censorship, or are we not able to think about the future because we've actually made people's lives precarious enough that actually short-term gratification is the only way we survive in a precarious world, and then fear becomes the means? Now, the societal, the neuroscience of this stuff is more and more there, the analysis is there. What does that mean for design? How do we design in that context? I think those are, for me, not only do you measure it, we can see its influence, and we can recognize its micro-behavioral influence. How do we design for that? So I would say the thesis of why we lost control of the future is because we create the conditions that makes us hyper-present. And that's a design condition that actually produces with it huge losses. So that's why I kind of end with this, is I think being able to create the space for the other is actually a profound problem, but actually also a strategic opportunity, which I think which needs to be reimagined. So the dark matter has to be equally kind of concept with the dream matter and rebuilding capacity for a dream. I often was it Captain Kirk kissed Uhura in November 1968 on national TV, the first interracial kiss on national TV, and that was 6 months after Martin Luther King had been assassinated. So it's kind of interesting, interesting but also relevant of how we use the space of the imaginarium to actually change the social political discourse. I think we're going to have to do that to be able to unbind this. It's not just pure technological problem, it's an imagination problem as well. And those are built by conditions.
That was a wonderful talk, post-disciplinary. It's like Karl Marx talking to us with a Foucault head and Bruno Latour clothes. Very difficult to understand if you think in terms of disciplines, because if I was a Marxist, I would ask you, like, where's critique here? If I were a Foucauldian, I would ask you, where's modernity? If I were a feminist, I would ask you, where are women? So my question is, I'm neither and all at the same time. My question is, who's your audience when you put together a piece of philosophy like this? Is it CEOs that you're trying to convince? Is it academics at New School? Is it union bodies? Is it politicians? Because your presentation draws on liberal democracy, that draws on rule of law. Because only in democracy you can ask what democracy is. In where I come from, you don't ask what democracy is because you don't have it, everyone wants it. You're in jail, you criticize a politician. So it draws on liberal capitalist democracy. And we're further trying to democratize an already democratic rule of law, which is kind of, this is not, I wish I would have democracy at home so that I can democratize it more. You see what I mean? Who's the audience here? I'm trying to ask the question. It's not a proper question, I know. I'm thinking with you. It's not a critique.
It's a great question. Here's the really odd answer. Bizarrely enough, this conversation is going on in Vietnam. So we're working with the Theoretical Council of Vietnam, who are thinking about this problem through this lens. The problem is that we are pejorative about our understanding of democracy. So when we talk about China, we sort of say that's not democracy. We sort of say, well, actually, it's a single-party democracy, which still has voting infrastructure and other mechanisms of governance. And I think what we have to start to reframe democracy as this distribution of agency. And it can be built through it can be bridged through multiple means. So growth, representation, it's a hybrid model, it's not a singular model. So for me, what I'm finding fascinating, and it's a really good question, is the audience is multiple levels. We're working at multiple governments, the governmental level. Yeah,
you mean your audience is everyone in the world?
We're not finding a space of differentiation. Like, so from Vietnam to Bangkok to Dubai to Scotland. Actually, what we're finding is in Scotland to Canada to Montreal federal government, components of this conversation are pretty much happening everywhere. Because some people will get the pure technocratic story. They'll get the, bureaucracy is being reimagined. But actually, how it's being reimagined, how it's being organized. System financing, most people get the nature of actually how we finance the social good. It requires a different model of organizing. It requires us to be able to invest in multiple social interventions to work in a coordinated sense. How do we do that? How do we organize that? Actually, that's kind of.
So, would you make this presentation to a fascist?
So, the question I would raise, and it's a really good philosophical question at the structural level, I would argue that the question I bring to, so why I talk about this in the UK is, say, the Brexit conversation. Brexit is a function of certain things that are in play. So I suppose I'm a structuralist, right? I I think Brexit is a function of structural moves that have been put into play. And to unwind those moves and to reverse them or just replay them, you have to start to replay those structures and unwind some of those structures. So whether I play to the, there are parts of the world we just refuse to work, but actually what I'm really interested in is actually where's the capacity to make those structural moves. And more, I would say it's that's guiding us right now. So where's the structural capacity? And what we've basically done, what I've given you is a compilation. But what we actually do is every one of these things is broken into 100 shards. So every one of those projects are micro projects happening all around the world. Somebody doing street licensing, somebody doing actually the future of being human as a piece of thesis, somebody doing actually property rights and unbundling property rights and being able to link them back to public goods. So what we're doing is breaking up this thesis to lots of componentary parts to be able to prototype and test them at a macro level. It's the most efficient way for us to do it. So in Canada, we're looking at civic capital now, which is looking at the idea of civic assets and how do you invest into civic assets, because the civic good infrastructure exists sufficient to be able to prototype it. So our thesis of operation is by breaking this thesis up into lots of different components. That's where we're operating. So in advanced economies like the UK, you can talk about systems change and radical childcare because the infrastructure exists and the institutional infrastructure exists. So every one of these components has been broken up. And in a way, for the talk, what I've done is actually packed it together to see the underlying thesis that we're pulling together of how we're operating around these three things. And they're all discoveries. The future of being human, I do not know. But I do know it has fundamental questions of freedom. The next thesis we will almost certainly put together is freedom in the 21st century, because I want to pull it back from the kind of neoliberal discourse of freedom and pull it back into a new discourse of freedom. And so what does sovereignty mean in a world of interdependency? These things have to be recaptured and brought back into a new social discourse. So that's, if you want to know how we're operating, that's how we're doing it. So this is, you see the kind of meta-narrative, but actually it's been broken into lots of different components and then prototype travel. Good question.
I can't stop with the political question, because that was very helpful to hear you describe how you're sort of collecting multifarious bits of projects or kind of evidence and sort of packaging it for us. Whereas as you were talking, I did find myself thinking, where in the world could anybody not only get their mind around all the complexity that you were describing, but implement even a quarter of it? It couldn't happen in a democracy. I mean, right now, the Western democracies, we're witnessing how vulnerable they are to demagogic kind of politics, but also how difficult it is to think really long term in a democratic society that has regular voting. Whereas a society that doesn't need to hold itself accountable in that way, like China, is in some ways able to function much more strategically, thinking more long term. I think that's happening in sort of renewable energy, green energy there, even though China continues to put a lot of coal-fired power plants online right now, but it also has a longer term strategy. So I did find myself thinking, only a king or some kind of enlightened dictator could possibly implement even a fraction of the kinds of things that you were talking about, top-down way.
Perhaps not. I think that's to do a lot with how we interpret our democracy. I think we've misinterpreted democracy. We've misinterpreted democracy into being the harvesting of reactionary opinion. And I think that's been one of the biggest fallacies of the last 30 years, is that we've understood it as eventually the kind of harvesting of reactionary opinion. So we did a piece of work around universal basic income. And it's kind of really, really important life lesson for us, where we basically took it was a kind of large public audience, and we said, how many people believe in universal basic income? 70% of people said no. Everyone's going to game the system, everyone's going to get lazy, no one's going to do any work. 6 hours later, through a deliberative process where they were talking to other strangers, doing research themselves, that figure had reversed almost 180 degrees. 70% of people said yes, 30% people said no. And the biggest reaction I understood there was actually our political architectures. Our architectures for building politics have been entirely focused on reactionary systems and harvesting of opinion rather than the frameworks for deliberative debate. So we are building the politics of our political infrastructures. The medium of our political engines is the message. And if we want to change our politics, it's actually not a problem of our demigods and sort of our politicians. It's that we've actually broken our infrastructures of political debate. So I would, so if you look at citizen assemblies, extraordinary piece of work that happened in Ireland, where they got rid of all the abortion issues because they actually built deliberative discourses throughout Ireland, and that was an extraordinary move to do that. So we're seeing new infrastructures for political debate that are able to make long-term sustainable decisions in a way that we could never imagine before. So I think the challenge is how do we create that infrastructure? And I think if we could highlight the fact that our politics is a function of our political infrastructure, not necessarily the message. And that is a kind of self-critique that I think we need to have. So I don't think this is a problem of needing kings. I think we just haven't got the political infrastructure to actually have that level of debate.
I can just talk loud. It's cool.
Well, we're trying to get it on tape.
And this may follow on to what you were just speaking on with kind of dialogue as a critical component. But I'm curious, as you're talking about this reorientation around what democracy really means, I'm curious about how you raise that level of consciousness and intentionality at an individual or mass level, where people are really thinking about democracy or engaging in different ways.
So, in a weird way, I think what we're seeing is as politicians become less and less able to actually make complex decisions, they're having to revert to alternative infrastructures. So, citizen jury is used in Australia to deal with nuclear waste, or whether we've got, like I said, abortion in Ireland in a deeply Catholic economy to be able to deal with controversial legislation, building the politics of that. So I think what we're seeing is already new politicians looking for new political infrastructures to be able to deal with these long-term structural issues. So I don't think that's a challenge. I think that's going to be a growing movement of a conversation. So one of the things that we're looking at, if you're building a regulatory sandbox, to be able to reimagine that, you put a citizen assembly or citizen jury at the end of that to give it actually a different model of legitimacy rather than cascading back out to politicians. So I think we're going to build it at an incremental level. That'll build us the capacity to have that. And the way you see citizen assemblies work, it's an extraordinary format because it does build that deliberative capacity to make complex decisions, which is actually what we need. And it builds the politics around those decisions because actually it's done in different ways. So I don't think there's anything dysfunctional about our democracy. We've just actually designed it, we misunderstood it. And we misunderstood it, or we've been made to misunderstand it as basically, I'm representing your opinion. And so if 40% of you say Brexit is good, I'm going to go ahead and do that. That's not how it works. Because actually, complex decisions, you have to create the frameworks for deliberative debate, which is why we create something called a parliament, for actually that deliberative debate around an issue. So representation is not the representation of my opinion, it's the representation of my being. And so I think we've misunderstood it, and we've allowed it to be misunderstood in a very poor way. And I think that's a real challenge, right? So, and that's the thing that we have to start to reorganize and build the new political infrastructures around.
Okay, so I think if there are no more questions, we have one more.
It's a very practical question. Thank you for your talk. Being here at a school where we're all thinking about ways of innovating, I'm curious if you have any thoughts about how education might need to change or adapt to some of the challenges to do some of the things that you've been describing and visions you've been showing us.
I think the biggest thing I would say is that in the next 10 years, I think big. I think break out of the cycle of kind of imagining, this is my conversation over lunch, like we've been locked into a discourse of kind of imagining the community garden is going to save the world. And it's great. It was perfect for 2004, but that isn't where the future lies right now. And also just remember what extraordinary things we've done in history and extraordinary social moves that we've done. So in history, for example, whether it's 1822, the UK government spent 25% of GDP, 1822, to buy out every slave and to free slavery. That was what was done, 1822, 25% of GDP. National health was built after World War II. We have built large-scale transitions, not only in the UK but globally. And I think we have to start to reimagine different scales of transitions that are possible. And I think they're already on the table. The reason why UBI is being discussed, UBI is not about money. UBI is about taking money off the table to allow for a discovery economy to emerge, and the idea of reframing the value of humans in that story. And that's going to require a new interface of automation. How do you destroy bad jobs, right? Bullshit jobs. How do you destroy the economy of bullshit jobs? So there's a kind of a whole thesis at the center of that. So my biggest thing would be, how do we start to think big, commensurate to the scale of challenges that we have, and also recognize the role of societal innovation in that story. I think that's going to be foundationally different. And the ethics of that. I think the ethical infrastructures are going to be more and more poignant as we play them out.
So I think we can end with that hopeful note, and maybe I'd like to ask for a round of applause to Indy.